Every year, thousands of people are stopped, arrested, convicted, and sent to U.S. prisons. But the Washington Post notes on January 31st of 2016 that 100,000 of those people will be placed in solitary confinement with an average of 54 days spent without human contact. But that's exactly why The Atlantic explains on January 26th of 2016 that President Obama took executive actions when it came to solitary confinement, including even banning it for youth, saying that he believed it was to protect prison populations. But just a day earlier, Politico noted on January 25th of 2016 that while these reforms represented a positive step forward, our prison system is fundamentally broken, with many other reforms that could take place. Just because you commit a crime and are sentenced to prison doesn't mean that you should have to sacrifice your own humanity. And considering that Bloomberg Business on April 7th of 2016 explains that for every 100,000 Americans, 698 are currently serving time in prison, the highest average around the world, it becomes imperative that we ask today's question: what additional protections should the U.S. government guarantee its incarcerated population? And the answer is the U.S. government needs to guarantee additional protections by protecting prisoners from prison administration. And they can do so in three specific ways. First, by stemming guard corruption through federal investigations. Second, by passing budget initiatives to fund health care for prisoners. And finally, by passing initiatives to help prisons' most vulnerable populations. First, amongst American television, shows like Orange is the New Black have become extremely popular with characters like Pornstache and Lubsack. The only problem is that these characters aren't too far based from reality, and guard corruption is a very real problem, which is the first additional protection that the United States should guarantee prisoners. It should stymie guard corruption through federal investigation. NPR explains on February 11th of 2016 that in a 6-month federal investigation, within Georgia alone, 130 people were arrested for trafficking drugs in prison, 40 of which were guards at the top of the food chain distributing drugs amongst prisoners. And when you're in prison making very little money, it's easy to have a guard manipulate you into making a deal simply so that you can continue to provide for your family back home. But this isn't the only way in which abuse takes place, because as The Atlantic explained on January 21st of 2016, 2 federal officers in a federal investigation pled guilty after beating a man in a wheelchair, throwing him down the stairs, and then falsifying reports to cover up the entire incident. Federal investigations brought these incidents to the light, and additional federal investigations can bring more and more of this guard corruption to the forefront of prison reform conversations. And by doing so, we can protect prisoners from the people who are supposed to protect them, the guards. Second, many people would argue that health care is a basic human right. That is, of course, unless you're in prison, which is the second way in which the U.S. federal government can add additional protections for the population of prisoners against prison administration by passing budget initiatives that actually help those who need medical care. The Guardian explains, this time on February 26th of 2016, that Georgia got in trouble, or more specifically Louisiana got in trouble, after it failed to provide HIV medication to the prisoners. Essentially, prisoners were going 3 or 4 months without any type of drug treatment. But The Atlantic on January 21st of 2016 expands that it wasn't just Louisiana. It was happening with a variety of illnesses, going places like Georgia, not treating their cancer patients. But it's not a surprise considering that we don't fund these types of issues. With the Center for Budget Policy and Priorities explaining on January 31st of 2016 that there's currently a bill in front of the House in which they would cut funding to prisons for medical spending. Prison administration consistently denies treatment to prisoners, but that's because they don't have the money. The federal government could fix that, and in doing so, ensure that prisoners receive this critical health treatment, protecting them from administrative budget cuts and helping them stay healthy. Finally, many people assume that those who go to prison are society's worst, justifying that in looking away from the violence that occurs within the inner walls of prisons themselves. But that's no longer an excuse. And the final way in which the U.S. federal government can provide extra protections for prisoners against the very administration that's supposed to protect them is by launching initiatives to help the most vulnerable population. Vox News explains on April 11th of 2016 that when you go to prison, it's an awful experience for many. For transgendered people, it's straight hell, as they're completely ignored by administrations. But it's not just those in the LGBTQ community who struggle in prison. As solitary confinement measures also demonstrate, it's those who are mentally ill, who when placed in prison because of the stressful factors that surround them, can only cause them to react in negative ways, gain additional time, and create a negative feedback loop. There are pockets of people living in these prison populations who, because of the circumstances of prison, ensure that they will never get out. However, as Politico notes on March 25th of 2016, former Attorney General Eric Holder does have a proposal in which he's reforming women's prisons to include things like helping drug rehabilitation, as well as education. If there are initiatives happening at women's prisons, we can expand them across the United States, ensuring that our most vulnerable populations, whether inside or outside of prisons, are protected by the federal government, because everyone deserves to be protected. The prison system is broken, and when returning to today's question, what additional protections should the U.S. guarantee its incarcerated population? The answer is we need to protect prisoners from the prison administration meant to protect them in the first place. First, by stemming guard corruption. Second, by providing actual health care. And finally, by protecting the most vulnerable populations. President Obama made major steps with reform, but we have far, far to go.